Welcome all to the Food Thinkers for this month. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this Food Thinkers seminar, part of our Women Redesigning Food Systems webinars, which bring together big ideas from women in academia, policy, business and advocacy on redesigning food systems. My name is Professor Corinna Hawkes. I'm Director of the Centre for Food Policy, and I'm delighted this evening to welcome Anna Taylor of the Food Foundation. Anna is Executive Director of the Food Foundation, and many of you will be familiar with the work of the Food Foundation, which works in partnerships with researchers, campaigners, community bodies, industry, government and citizens to galvanise diverse agents of change to secure a sustainable food system which delivers health and well-being for all. And that is really an opening to an organisation which has done some absolutely phenomenal work in the past few years, and I would encourage you all, if you haven't done so already, to go to their website to see the fantastic work that Anna has developed from scratch, from the very beginnings when she joined the Food Foundation a few years ago as its founding executive director, as its initial executive director, and an incredibly impressive growth of a fabulous organisation, working mainly in the UK, but also with a global food systems project as well. So all of those of us working in the UK are very grateful for Anna for the work that she's done with the Food Foundation and how she's enriched the UK food policy landscape, which I'm sure will become global very soon. Until 2015, Anna worked with development agencies, notably Save the Children and the UK, what was formerly the UK Department for International Development, focusing on tackling child undernutrition and securing international policy commitments. And now she's focused on reorienting the food system in the UK to deliver better diets, especially for the least affluent. So today Anna is going to be talking to us about changing the essence of food. The webinar will be recorded and it will be available online afterwards on our YouTube channel. We do advertise our webinars in our newsletter and in separate mail outs. So if you want to sign up for those, please do put that into the chat where your email address and name will be seen only by the panelists. Now, what's going to happen this evening is that Anna's going to give a talk for 30-40 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So do start posting into the Q&A as soon as you have a question. I will moderate those Q&A and share those questions with Anna for her to answer. Most of all, we want you to listen and engage and ask Anna questions. If you do want to share anything you hear over Twitter, that would also be great. Our hashtag is Food Thinkers and the handle is @FoodPolicyCity. This is a series that will continue throughout 2021 and beyond. Do join us on March the 17th with Pam Brunton of Inver Restaurant in Scotland, who is a chef owner of that restaurant, who will be giving our next Food Thinkers. But now over to Anna, speaking on changing the essence of food and what's happened to food in the UK. How can we make sense of it? Reasons to be hopeful. And I think what Anna is going to share with us is the opportunity of 2021 and what opportunity there is now to think about change and change in the food system. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Corinna, for such a lovely introduction. I'm very grateful, and thank you so much for inviting me to do this talk today. And it's kind of helped me to take a bit of time out to actually do some thinking, given the name of this event, Food Thinkers, and think a little bit about where we are now and where we're going this year. And I think there's the sort of opportunity of being relatively near the start of the year, though I guess we're already a good chunk of the way in, to look ahead, but also to reflect back on the last year, given that we're almost a year from when the pandemic really started to hit the UK. And so what I'm going to try and do really is think about the last 12 months and think about the next 12 months, and try and just pull out some reflections. I know many of you will, probably the reason that you're coming is because you care deeply about the environment, our health, inequalities, and the food, the way in which the food system impacts those things. So I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to chat about those things, I mean, in the way that we can in this kind of format, but to hear your reflections as well when we come to the point of discussion. And I suppose I'm also assuming and hoping really that you're feeling in need of a good dose of hope, because this is a fairly I'm trying to be quite optimistic in this presentation, unapologetically so really, because that's really what gets me through the day. And I think what I'm trying to do here is to pull out some of the things which I think we can be hopeful about on the back of what's been a pretty terrible year. And hopefully that will also help us to think about what we can do with those glimmers of hope, how we can make them bigger and more important as we endeavour collectively to try and change the food system around us. So obviously this is just one perspective on what's happened in the last year. You'll all have very many different perspectives, so I'm not in any way trying to say this is comprehensive, but it will just give you a bit of a flavour and drawing on some of the work that we've been doing in the Food Foundation. So this is pretty much a year ago. We were struck with, what at the time was a pretty shocking state of affairs in terms of empty shelves. And it had knock-on impacts on very many areas of our lives, not just obviously the pandemic, not just the empty shelves had, I think, a set of impacts, but more importantly, the ways in which the pandemic has affected how we think about food, our access to food, and so forth. So I'm going to just run through some of those sort of characteristics really around how the pandemic affected food. We had that experience, and I think that the empty shelf experience, and I think that I've heard in numerous conversations really the extent to which that made people sort of ask questions really about how food gets to the shelves and how critical it is to us that the shelves are stocked, and how dependent we are on what seemed at that point to be quite a fragile system. We've taken a dramatic shift to online purchasing. This is retail sales more generally, not just food, but you can see there's been a sort of slow and steady increase over the last decade and a half until 2020, when sales jumped up very significantly, online sales, and some supermarket retailers are reporting very high percentages of now their sales have shifted to online. So that's quite an important behavioural factor that we're coming into 2021, which we need to think about, has quite big implications for policy if that is sustained in the food sector. We also thought a little bit more about where our food came from, and many people started looking for more local supplies of food. We did a survey of farms that provide veg boxes direct to customers across the UK. We did this in partnership with a number of different organisations, and saw a really significant leap in the number of veg boxes delivered by those farms pre and post lockdown. Veg box sales increased by more than doubled in the 6 weeks between the end of February 2020 and mid 2020. And our estimates are that about 3 million people tried a veg box scheme or ordered food from a local farm for the very first time. So there was quite a significant shift in that direction. There's also some, and I'm going to show you now some data which has been recently published by the Zoe trial, which is a massive survey filled in by more than 1 million people in the UK and the US as part of the COVID symptom tracker app. If you want to hear more about this, there's a nice YouTube link there to a webinar where some of this data is discussed. But what they do, interestingly, is obviously it's not, these are people who volunteer to fill in the questionnaire. It's a very, very large number of people, obviously, in a huge data set, but it's not nationally representative. That said, it's not wildly different from the national population when they look at some of the core demographic characteristics. It tends to be a bit older. The population tends to be slightly more affluent than the general population. So that's something to bear in mind. But what they show, they look at the sort of level of disruption using a disruption index, which people report experiencing as a result of COVID. And they look at weight changes and also a set of behaviours around health and well-being, and see how people responded. I think the important points that they note is that the disruption was greatest for younger women, and those living in more deprived areas experienced a greater disruption to diet, sleep and activity levels. Interestingly, the overall effects on on the population in the sample's weight was negligible. But as we've seen, I think across a number of areas, the way in which the pandemic affected people has been very variable. So a large number of people, almost a third, lost weight, and almost a third gained weight. So the net effect was negligible, but obviously significant impacts on significant subsets of the population. And here you can see some of the reported effects on other behavioural characteristics, so snacking, sleep, alcohol, activity. And the numbers above are where people reported increasing those things, and the number below where they reported decreasing those things. So you see across the piece really that while you might have, a good chunk of people who are cutting back on snacking, a similar chunk of people who are eating more snacks. And the overall effects on healthy eating specifically, which aren't shown in the actual visual there, are 32% increase fruit and veg consumption, while 22% decreased. So I think we're individuals and we respond very differently to a shock of this kind, but there are obviously some subsets of the population who have been particularly adversely affected by the crisis. And then, of course, we stopped eating out, at least during the lockdown periods. And this just shows the sort of reduction in the size of the out-of-home market compared to the whole food and drink market, dropping down quite significantly from 2019 to 2020. I was actually surprised that it was even at 19%, but there was obviously a period at the beginning of the year and also over the summer when people were eating out. And you can see the reflection of this in these. This is share price changes for the major food sectors, if you like. So food retail being the blue line, saying it sort of hasn't really changed very much over the period of the pandemic, and is a little bit skewed by Ocado anyway, who've done very well. But you can see there, catering and casual dining have really taken a very, very big hit in terms of their share price over the period of the pandemic. The FTSE 100 line is there in black in the middle. Fast food showing a similar performance to retail. And then one area where we've looked in a lot of detail is food access, which we know deteriorated for many people. Here we've been doing, we're just about to actually publish our 7th round of surveys of the general population to understand moderate and severe food insecurity. And by that, we mean we ask a series of questions. These are standardized questions which are used by national governments across the world, including the UK government, to ask people about experiences of food insecurity. We ask 3 questions. One is about skipping meals, the other is about going hungry but not eating because of access to food problems, and then going for 24 hours without eating. So there are 3 questions that are asked and linked directly to not being able to afford or access food. And what we've seen over the course of the crisis is that food insecurity was extremely high in the first 2 weeks of lockdown. It improved significantly through May and June and July. It's improved a little over the summer period. The latest results there, which we're actually publishing properly on Monday, show 6.8% of, this is all adults, experienced food insecurity in the previous month. The levels are higher when we ask about a 6-month recall period, not surprisingly. So that's an important thing to bear in mind when we're talking about this data. The recall period really matters. And these levels are significantly higher than pre-COVID, We know that because the Food Standards Agency, who is gathering data in its food and use surveys that allow us to make some comparisons. I think even more concerning, however, is what's happened to particular subgroups of the population. And Rachel Loopstra from King's College has been doing some detailed analysis of this, which she'll be publishing very soon, and particularly taking a look at food insecurity amongst households with a BAME adult or households with an adult that has a disability or a life is limited a little or a lot by disability or a health condition. And here, these are levels of food insecurity over the period of the pandemic. And what's important to note here is that the purple bars are white ethnicity, the green bars are BAME households. And you can see there the change between the first phase of the pandemic and that inequality widening in the most recent set of the data, which is the period August to January. So the last 6 months, those differences between white ethnicity household and other households have widened. These widening of inequalities has been even more pronounced amongst households with a disability. And I think this data, as we got it in, has just been very upsetting, actually. And I think we're now talking to Disability Rights UK about trying to understand why the situation has got so bad for these households, and they understand all of those reasons, and I think we'll be talking more publicly about some of that soon. But I think what you can see here is these very, very marked disparities where you've got levels of food insecurity that's currently 5 times higher amongst these households than in households where there's not an adult affected by a disability. So what we've seen, what we see throughout our data really is these sort of combined effects of the economic impact of the crisis on people's budgets, but also the impact of needing to isolate or shield, and the implications that has had for some households in affecting their food access, which has been really profound. I think the other thing that we've seen during the crisis is, as I'm sure many of you have experienced personally as well, is communities really looking out for one another, and whether that's local authorities really stepping up and perhaps mobilising food partnerships that they might have or had already in place to reach the vulnerable with food parcels and a range of other services, and particularly seeking out households where access to food has been a real problem, but also neighbours looking out for one another, friends and relatives looking out for one another. And I think a sort of important thought that I think we should keep hold of as we think about what to be hopeful about in the coming year. And I also just wanted to flag again, this is sort of forthcoming work that Rachel Loopstra has been doing. The web link is there for it, but she's going to be publishing very soon a set of quite detailed case studies of different local authority responses to the pandemic on food. And from talking to her, what she said has been so striking was the huge sort of variation and creativity which different local areas have demonstrated in their responses. And it's very difficult to make kind of comparative judgments about those that did well or didn't do well. There was just such a heterogeneous response, which again I think is something to be to think about in terms of future policy and how you enable communities to respond in the ways which are right for them and give them the power and opportunity to be able to shape that response and really and make it work. So something else to be thinking about. And then very importantly, from our perspectives, in the Food Foundation, free school meals became really a defining feature of the pandemic. There was a whole number of different little videos and wrap-up things at the end of 2020, which talked about the sort of year in either in comedy terms or in, you know, more serious journalism, which actually everything seemed to refer to the free school meals conversation. And I think there were a whole series of milestones, I suppose, to that conversation, and it's continuing really. And I would say it is a conversation because the public have got very, very involved and shown how much they care on signing up to Marcus Rashford's petition back in the autumn, in the run up to the half-term break. But also in their discussion of the issues on social media and the extent to which Marcus Rashford, by talking about his own personal experience growing up, he created space and sort of gave permission really to others to speak up about their experiences. And I think anyone who's done work around food poverty will know that this is people who are experiencing food poverty are often very reluctant to talk about their experiences. It's something that they wrongly feel, you know, ashamed of. But that's the stigma that society creates around people in these circumstances. And I think also often people feel nervous about talking about their experiences because of the potential implications of doing so. And I think Marcus opened up space for people to talk about their experiences, and that I think was very, very powerful. So I think the conversation about free school meals has been really, yeah, like I say here, a defining feature of the pandemic, but also something which we need to really think about as we go into 2021 and think about where food policy can improve in the coming months. So now I'm going to start just looking forward a little. And I know that last month, Agnes Kalibata did a talk about the here at Food Thinkers about the UN Food Systems Summit. So some of you may have been at that talk and heard in detail about that opportunity. But obviously that is one of several opportunities coming up this year. And I think these are important for a couple of reasons. I think they create these events, whether they're national or international events, they create opportunities for policymakers and business leaders to set out their stall, set out the areas that they want to make change in and make commitments. They help to force the process of making commitments. So in that sense, I think they have value, these international moments. And I think importantly, they also help to redefine or reshape the narrative in thinking about the diagnosis of the problem around food systems, and also in thinking about how we frame solutions. And so in that sense, I think they can be very valuable because they bring so many people together with different experiences and perspectives and allow that kind of churn and exchange to happen. So in the UK, we've got obviously the National Food Strategy is going to be publishing part 2 in the coming months, and that will create an opportunity and a process through which the UK government will be ultimately, we hope, obviously that's an independent review and the government will respond to that in the form of a white paper, but a process through which the UK government can make new commitments. This is a food foundation, but working with lots of others. Moment that I wanted to flag is that in the summer months, assuming this is able to happen, it's looking reasonably positive that it will at the moment, is a youth food festival that we are convening at the end of July at the Valley Fest Festival, where we're really trying to help, working with others to develop, bring together young campaigners who are wanting to see food system change, give them an opportunity to meet with one another, to meet with experts, to quiz business leaders and policymakers, and to interact with journalists and have an opportunity to really think about how they can galvanize their energy and work together as to be a sort of force for food system change, both in the UK and connecting with young people internationally. So that's going to be an important moment in our calendar. And then there are several, obviously, other events later in the year. The UN Food Systems Summit, COP26 in Glasgow, which presents a real opportunity to talk about the ways in which the food system needs to be reoriented to protect nature and tackle climate change. And then the Nutrition for Growth Summit, which will also have a food systems lens at the end of the year and at the tail end of the hosting of the Tokyo the Olympics in Japan. So there's the point really of this slide is to say there are some moments when we can expect to see signs of change over the coming year, which I think we should be watching for. But then we also need to remember this before we get to the hope. These are the things that we need to be a little bit worried about. These are the headwinds, if you like. And I think we can learn a little bit from what happened in the 2008 food price crisis and the economic impact that had and the impact that had on the global economy and the British economy, and the banking crisis and so forth. And here you can see on the slides the food prices and the extent to which they went up in 2008, the UK line along the top there in light green, and what happened to food expenditure per adult equivalent in the UK. I think while we're not facing a food price crisis at the moment, though actually global food prices, cereals are going up at the moment. It's not having knock-on effects on the UK, but there are also some concerns that some of the new requirements for imports and exports around Brexit will soon start to have knock-on effects on food prices in the UK. We've yet to see that. But I think more importantly, perhaps, is the fact that we've had the pandemic has hit people's purses very significantly, and with less purchasing power, we can expect perhaps to see a similar effect on household expenditure. And so when we compare the years before the recession in 2005 to 2007 with 3 years later, households on average reduced their real expenditure on food purchases by 8.5% and reduced the calories they purchased as well by about 4%. And those changes coincided with an increase in the calorie density of foods. So households switched to focus on foods with more calories per kilogram and moved away from calories from fruit and vegetables. And some of the largest shifts were seen by households with young children and single parent households. So this is going to be a very significant, I'd say, headwind in the effort to try and help people to eat better and to be able to afford to eat well. I think the other thing to be concerned about is obviously there's been a huge growth in food aid, charitable food aid provision. You can see here on the right the number of parcels given out by Trussell Trust over the last 5 years, and then fair shares, tons of food dispatched by month during the months of last year. Hasn't yet been updated for August and September, but you can see there the huge increase in the number of food dispatched by fair share. And I think obviously this is was desperately needed, has been desperately needed, continues to be desperately needed in many communities. But I think its growth also is in danger of taking pressure off the actually having a safety net and income support for households, which allows them to be able to afford to eat well. Obviously, going to a food bank is not something we should be expecting people to do. It doesn't protect their dignity, and I think we need to be in a situation where we are really thinking about how food surplus can be used to support communities, but not be not be relying on it as a part of the safety net. And really thinking about how we make sure that the benefit system and wages are sufficient to be able to help people to secure a healthy diet. And then we also have the risks around policy incoherence, and Corinna's work on sort of policy coherence and policy incoherence has really been, groundbreaking. This is just, I think, one small example really that we've had in the last year of a risk around policy incoherence. The data aren't entirely sort of transparent on this, but this is the Eat Out to Help Out claims that were made by businesses during the period that the scheme was running. This was over the summer of last year. And I think, what's important to note here is that there was a spread across different sizes of business in terms of claiming the funds that were claimed. But what's important to note is that very large chains were using the scheme, and large numbers of claims were made through very large chains. And those very large chains tend to be the fast food chains, which are selling foods which are often not very good for our health. And in a context when we were also, as the UK, launching a new obesity strategy, this seemed to be somewhat disconnected in terms of policy goals. While there was an important goal to try and support the hospitality industry, it perhaps didn't do a great job in trying to align that goal with also delivering improved public health. I think there are also, I think what this also highlights is the fact that we've got a big headwind in terms of the economic recovery. And just last week, the Scottish Food and Drink Federation was calling for a moratorium on new policy measures which could have an economic impact on the industry. I think we need to be really mindful of that huge economic pressure when we're thinking about measures to improve the healthiness of our diets and the extent to which that's going to be a blockage. So that's the bad news out of the way. These are some of the reasons which I think we have to be hopeful, and this is what I really wanted to focus on. I think first of all, I'd say that the media narrative around food poverty has really shifted quite substantially. And I'd love to hear people's thoughts on whether they think that's right, and B, why they think that is, because I think there are lots of reasons that you could use to explain that. And there's lots and lots of evidence, I think, to suggest that narrative has changed. Certainly, we've been working on food insecurity in the UK for a number of years, and it's been quite difficult to get media coverage around new data which has come out on food insecurity across. But now we find that every newspaper, whatever the political spectrum, wants to report on food insecurity. So the media conversation around it has significantly changed. It's a story which is regarded as being of broad public interest, wherever you sit on the political spectrum. I think we're seeing now, recently we've seen the EFRA committee, the Parliamentary Select Committee, that's scrutinising the work around COVID and the food response, specifically recommending a Minister for Food Security that should be gathering data on food insecurity on an ongoing basis and providing that coordination function across government. And we're starting to see a number of cities, Liverpool and Manchester, pledging to become right to food cities. This is an interesting development in the last couple of months, where cities have acknowledged the extent to which the crisis has impacted on food affordability and putting in place commitments to try and address that. So I'd say we've had a broader shift in the media around how food poverty is talked about, and then specifically within that, a focus on children and school meals. Holiday hunger has become, mainstream conversation. How the holidays have been dealt with on a consistent basis from half-term holidays and the long summer break. There's been a lot more conversation about children who miss out from free school meals, and particularly those children with no recourse to public funds, and the government's put in place special measures for some of those children. And then more recently, through the conversation about parcels, the quality of school meals has come into the spotlight, and also questions about businesses who are providing meals in schools. And I think what's interesting about all of this is the extent to which it's become an area of public concern and interest, which I'd say has been a really significant shift. And of course, Marcus Rashford's work on this has been groundbreaking, and much of this can be attributed to his leadership and his willingness to discuss the issues in public. We're hoping very much that this will lead on the school meals front to a review of free school meals, to actually, I think it was Owen Jones that talked about the pandemic as being a flare that has shone a light on the problems with some of these existing policies. And I'd argue that that's what's happened with the free school meals policy, is the pandemic has just revealed some of the cracks in the system, and where children are missing out, and where the measures that are in place are just not working hard enough for children. And I think a free school meals review, we feel, would be a really good step towards reviewing what's happened and putting in place measures to address those challenges. I think another reason to be hopeful is that, as I've mentioned, thanks in large amount to Marcus, lived experience has started to count. And we've been working with a group of young people who have themselves experienced food poverty in different forms over the course of their lives. And those young people are now meeting with Department for Education ministers regularly and talking to DFE staff. They've advised the advisory board that's been set up for the Holidays and Activities Fund that the government has invested in as a result of the Marcus Rashford campaign and the National Food Strategy recommendations. And I think I'm hopeful that we are getting to a point where policymakers think much more routinely about involving people with lived experience in the policy development process. In my view, it brings those it grounds those conversations in a way which can't be achieved by looking at academic research, and it also helps to connect policymakers with the issues in a very personal way that doesn't allow them to remove themselves from people's personal context. And that's incredibly powerful, in my view. And I'd just like to just pay a big tribute to the COVID Realities project. The link for it is in the bottom of the slide there, who've done really amazing work in trying to give people a voice about how the pandemic has hit them. That's been funded by the Nuffield Foundation. So lived experience counts. I think that's a reason to be hopeful. I'd also want to, I think the FSA has been doing really amazing work. It's often done with little fanfare, but they've been regularly tracking food insecurity. They've done some really fantastic qualitative work, and this is an arm's length government body, and I think we should be noting the fact that this has been going on. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's not really plugged into a government process that properly reviews this data and works out what needs to be done with it. But that shouldn't take away from the fact that the FSA has been doing really good work, and it provides an excellent building block for actually some really proper government leadership on how we're going to solve food insecurity. And of course, there's been a lot of conversation about the benefit system and universal credit, but we need to be mindful of the fact that food insecurity is not just a problem of the benefit system, though the benefit system does have many problems which are contributing to food insecurity, but it's also linked to low wages. And I think reasons to be hopeful: we've had two major supermarkets, Co-op and Morrison's, make commitments in the past 12 months to lift their staff pay to meet or exceed, in some instances, the real living wage set by the Real Living Wage Foundation. And I think this is important because this is obviously, the supermarket sector has been a sector that's done well during the COVID crisis. And yet we know that, I mean, our data, again, this is what we're going to be publishing next week, is that households with food sector workers have higher rates of food insecurity than the general population. And you can see that in the graphs there. The first set of green bars is for food insecurity in the last month, and then the second set of green bars is food insecurity in the last 6 months. So these are moderate and severe food insecurity. So I think that these two supermarkets have really led the way, and I hope that others will follow. Other reasons to be hopeful: the Prime Minister has been spearheading the effort to tackle obesity, and even in the midst of the COVID pandemic, we've had a new obesity plan. And you know, I think it would be wrong to say that the government's sitting on its hands when it comes to obesity, because I think, in fact, there are some actions that have been taken in this plan which are really bold around advertising and around promotions, which are very important, and I very much hope that they actually make it onto the legislature, because obviously there's various consultation processes in place. But and obviously this was spurred on by the fact that the death rate, the COVID death rate for people who are obese was 1.5 times higher than the general population, and this is clearly a problem that Britain really has to deal with. And the fact that the Prime Minister is personally backing it, I think, is a reason to be hopeful. And then I think another thing that's perhaps been happening less on the headlines and more behind the scenes is that retailers are really starting to think a bit more about their role in shifting consumption. I think they've obviously been doing a lot of work over the years in thinking about their supply chains and how to make sure those supply chains aren't doing damage to the environment or to people that work in their supply chains. So there's obviously a lot more work to be done in that area. But I'd say what's encouraging is that they're starting to really think more seriously now about their role in driving consumption shifts, whether that's towards more sustainable diets or towards healthier diets. We see that Sainsbury's is now reporting on a percentage of their food sales that are healthy. Previously, only Marks and Spencer were doing that. Tesco have set a target to increase meat alternatives. There's been recently, the Share Action have done a piece of work around an investor resolution on Tesco to ask them to set healthy food targets. We've been working with a number of retailers who've made pledges to increase the amount of vegetables they sell as part of our Please Please work. So we see this as being the signs of a shift in thinking amongst retailers, being more transparent about the role that they play in helping people to eat well, and the role that they play in creating food environments in which people are making their choices, and the way in which they can use those food environments for good. So I'd say this is the chinks of light here in terms of signs of progress. Obviously a huge journey still to go. And this, I think we have a huge opportunity with the out-of-home sector when it starts to recover. But I'm just not sure if and how we'll be able to seize this opportunity. I think if we reflect back over the years, the number of places where you can actually eat out. I mean, we looked at this data about 3 or 4 years ago now, and at that point, over the previous decade, the number of places to eat out had increased by 53% across the country over that 10-year period. So places to eat out have proliferated. And if we look now at the picture on where places that sell food, whether they're supermarkets or a kebab shop, 1 in 4 of the places where you can get food are now selling fast food. So we've got a huge out-of-home sector, and a lot of that out-of-home food is not on the good end of healthy eating, or healthy or sustainable eating. It's often very heavy in meat as well. We looked at the statistics, particularly around veg. We found that we get half a portion of veg for every 3 meals we eat out. This is sort of pre-COVID data. So I think the challenge as we build back the out-of-home sector, and let's hope it builds back quickly, is that how to do that in a way which really supports the dietary transition that we all would like to be seeing, and thinking about the policy measures which stimulate economic growth in the hospitality sector, and also help to align with those health and environment goals which really need to be built in. So I think we're going into a year when there's lots of opportunities for new commitments, and I think we should have very high expectations of UK leadership on food system transformation this year. The state has a vital role in setting in place the measures which then also in turn enable businesses and local communities to act. And there are some of the key areas where I think the state's role is clearly vital. But I think it's also important to note that it can't stop there. I'll give you an example. I mean, we have great school food policy on paper, but we still have some way to go before we have great school food. And so everybody's role in really changing the way that we think about food is important. And I think the question is, how can we get to the point where we're proud of the way that we eat, where it tells a story about our communities, where it underpins our resilience to disease, and the way that we produce it helps us to reverse species extinction or slow down global warming. How do we elevate the conversation such that how and what we eat becomes an election priority in the way that the NHS is, or that education is? It's sort of baffling to me, really, that eating is something which is the ultimate leveler. We all have to do it. We have to do it every day. It's at the heart of our common humanity. And yet food policy is often in a political backwater. And I've tried to argue here that we have some important chinks of light emerging from what's been a terrible and traumatic 12 months when it feels like we've lost so much. But hopefully we can all consider how we can mine some of these cracks or these chinks of light and amplify their effects. And I think, thankfully, because we all eat and we all interact with our food, we can all do something. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Anna, for that, and for focusing so strongly on the opportunities and hope for the future, and identifying really particular opportunity spaces and windows where we can focus. And I think this is inspiring for us in the UK as well as in other places as well. So thanks very much. Very inspiring to have all of that pulled together. also with some of the more difficult to view but very important data. And congratulations for the work that the Food Foundation have done in collaboration with others in pulling a lot of that data together. So it's really been a fantastic resource. So thank you, Anna. Lots of questions already coming in, and if you would like to pose a question, please do paste it into the Q&A rather than the chat. And as I said, we've already got a lot coming already, so I'll fire away with some of the questions that that have been asked. So I'll start with one from Salma. Some of them that have been asked, I think, were probably answered later on because they were asked quite near the beginning of the talk. But Salma touches on something which you did come back to later in the talk, but I think it would be useful to ask about, which is about the Right to Food campaign. Clearly, this is something that the Food Foundation has been active in, and you mentioned the Right to Food cities and some other areas. But why do you think this campaign is so particularly important, and the framing of the Right to Food campaign so important? And do you think it's going to be really pivotal in the campaign to end food insecurity and food injustice?
Yeah, really good question, and it's one that we're actually very actively in the team thinking about and discussing now. So I'm not going to give you a kind of definitive "this is our position." I'm just going to lay out what I think some of the issues are to think about with it. I hope that's okay. I think. First of all, I think when you go back to the right to food as it's sort of articulated in the UN's language and linked to the Covenant on Economic, Social, I'm going to get the list wrong, sorry, I always forget the full name of the covenant, but you'll know it better than me, it's framed very broadly. It's not just about food insecurity, it's about really establishing a food system which provides food which doesn't destroy the planet, as well as provides food which everybody can access and that's affordable to people. So I think that's an important, but of course it's been used in some settings to particularly focus in on the access question, and obviously the ways in which it's been incorporated into legislation in some countries like India, for example. It's very much used in those terms to secure access to public schemes for people that might be excluded from them. I think for me, there's a set of questions, there's a set of issues around the right to food which I would really think we need to be seeing in place in the UK, and those are a proper data collection around food insecurity and a mandated response to it. So in other words, not a situation like we have now, where we have, as I said, the Food Standards Agency really doing very good work on food insecurity, DWP starting to gather data, which in fact they'll publish in April for the first time, but no designated bit of government that has an eye over that data, is concerned about the fact that disabled households with disability have really experienced such dramatic shifts in food access, for example, and thinking about what needs to be done about that. That's a big problem, and that to me is a critical building block of the right to food, because it's about accountability and enshrining some responsibilities for acting. And I think that's a piece which we've got really missing at the moment. I think the other fact, when you look at how the right to food has been incorporated in other countries, they've placed a really critical role in the role of citizens and being involved in some of those policy processes. And I also think that's vitally important. I hopefully made those points when I talked about lived experience. I think for me, when people say, do we support the Right to Food campaign? Of course, we support the fact that everybody should have a right to getting the food that they need to live a healthy life. I think the question is, what does that actually look like in policy terms, and how will that make a difference to people's lives? And that's the challenging bit to really think through. And we've done our work with our young people around a Children's Right to Food Charter, which articulates some of those actions which we think need to be taken to start to put in place a right to food for children. But there's clearly a lot more to be done.
Great, thanks for the answer. I've got a question here from Anna Maria based on some of the data that you presented. And she says, what was the key action that made the difference for reducing food insecurity registered during the first lockdown and the last lockdown, which she observes seems to have just about halved?
Yeah, I mean, it was principally, we think, to do with first of all, the number of people that were isolating in that first period and really not going out at all, and the people who were shielding, and also to do with the shortages on the shelves. And I think what was very striking is that if you've not got a lot of money and you're shopping, you might have £20 a week to do a shop for your family, you don't have a lot in the cupboard. And so your stocks are very, very low. And so while you might be managing just about to put food on the table, if you couple that with empty shelves, and particularly people talked about the ranges being reduced and particularly the value end of the ranges getting cut, and promotions went down quite significantly as well. The IFS have documented that. Those effects during that first period of the empty shelf factor was really quite significant. And I think that was why we saw such a huge peak at the beginning. But don't forget, of course, the levels now are still higher than pre-COVID. So we're seeing still the economic effects and the effects of isolation. We're still seeing that now.
Great, thanks for that clarification. Tanya's got a question about the link between addressing food poverty and the whole kind of local sustainable food agenda. Do you see any live discussion going on about linking addressing food poverty with efforts to make food more sustainable and local, which rightly or wrongly is often associated with food getting a little bit more costly?
Sorry, can you just say the beginning bit of the question again? So is it the question, are these at odds with each other? Is that the question?
No, or is there a discussion about how to bridge those agendas?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think there is. And I think there's the question about, I mean, I talked a little bit about food charity or food aid, and the harnessing of food surplus out of the food industry or the retail sector, and that being channeled to food charities. And I think, you know, there's a concern about that longer term because of the implications for it being used as a substitute safety net. If we don't think about it in those terms and we get the safety net sorted out, I think there's also there's a question about food surplus and the extent to which secondary markets can be created around it for healthy food, particularly fruit and veg. I'd really like to see more thinking evolved in that area, and I know there's there's small scale work going on in that area with sort of food clubs and pantries and so forth, which I think is really, really interesting. In terms of the question about whether or not more locally sourced food could drive up prices, I mean, I think interestingly we saw when we spoke to the veg box providers that a number of them had actually carved out ranges or price brackets for people either working in the NHS or people that were on low income, and had done so within their business models, which is really, really interesting, I thought. So specifically trying to think about their role in segmenting the market a little bit and setting a price point which allows for cross subsidization. So I don't think these things need necessarily to be at odds with one another, but obviously the devil is in the detail and how you actually make programs like this work. And there's amazing practice going on in different levels across the UK, and so much to learn from. I think we struggle at the moment to think about how some of that can be taken to scale, and that's, you know, something to really think about.
Great, thank you. I've got a couple of lots and lots of questions coming in. It's great. A couple of questions here, which I'll ask both of them. First from Mania, and Mania says that the local authority where they work stepped in to provide food aid at the beginning of the pandemic, and this is still available, though demand is minimal. And the council is considering some form of food parcel provision over the long-term basis for people in crisis. But the concern here is about institutionalisation of food aid. So what would your advice be to local authorities about the provision of food parcels over the longer term? That's the first question. And then the second question is from Steffi, and she wonders how the pandemic has changed the pattern of food donation to food banks and how that might have changed. So both questions about food as aid there.
So in terms of advice to local authorities, I think I would, I think we need to keep in mind that for some households, actually receiving a food parcel is a great thing. If you've, and particularly for some households, pre-prepared food, a cooked meal. So if you've got, if you're shielding, if you've got poor cooking facilities and so forth, there might be a number of reasons why you might actually really value actually having food. So I don't think we should kind of rule that out as an option. And I think the pandemic, because of the isolation factor, has actually increased the number of people who are in that situation. However, I think in the longer term, of course, I would certainly be urging local authorities to be using the resources that they have to think about cash first options, because they're always going to be that they'll always in a situation where people don't particularly want a food parcel, a family's going to be much better able to buy the food that they want to buy. And much better to give people, the capacity to do that. I mean, local authorities have been doing a lot around welfare assistance grants, and some of those grants can also be used for white goods where people don't have a fridge. They're moving into accommodation where there's vital things that they need to be able to actually eat reasonably. And so I think local authorities, I hope, will continue to play a role in helping people in those really dire circumstances. So I think I would still encourage a sort of openness to a hybrid approach, but focus on cash. And I think also, as we come out of the pandemic and people can mix again, I think let's not forget the role which food can play in tackling social isolation. Forget environment, forget health, right? People come together around food. It's the way that we show one another that we care for each other. We do that through food. There are numerous examples. When you think about it in your own life, you start to spot them. And I think caring for one another, bringing people together to eat and showing that we care for one another and giving them food is a way of building community, building a better society, and helping people to overcome social isolation, which has been extreme for some people over the last 12 months. So sort of setting food insecurity aside, I think local authorities could also be thinking quite creatively about how they can use food to strengthen social bonds and help to build people's social capital and help to tackle social isolation. Donations to food banks. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that I think the story is that donations to food banks were there was a problem at the start because a lot of in-kind donations dropped, particularly because there were shortages in the supermarket. So when people were donating in the supermarket trolley, they were no longer doing that because there were shortages going on. But that quite quickly shifted to cash donations, I think, were then made to food banks. I don't know the picture now and the extent to which food banks are struggling with donation. I haven't heard that that's a major problem at the moment, but it might be that I'm a bit out of touch on that.
Thanks, Anna. And a quick follow-up here from Bahawe, who says, do you think that some level of mandatory food standards would be effective to enforce the provision, making sure that food aid provision is of nutritious foods?
Yeah, I mean, I think we really have lacked that throughout, really, is proper. I mean, there's been some guidance around it, but it's not been really enforced. And I think absolutely, I think we should be having standards about food parcels. We shouldn't be giving out. I mean, I saw some horrific stuff early on around sort of 4-litre things of orange squash being given to people in food parcels, which just think this feels like the wrong kind of food to be giving people in a food parcel. So I think yeah, I would say that's a very good thought, and I know various people have been thinking about it, and I'm not quite sure whether that idea has progressed further at this point, but it's certainly something which should be done.
And there's a theme continuing. Michael's got a question, noting the large increase in food boxes that were the growth in veg boxes, in particular in the UK. He asks, is it true that food insecure people typically lack access to the possibilities of affordable food boxes that they can access? I think you've touched on this already, and Michael's an American, so asking from that perspective, saying that in the US, food stamps are only designed to cover 60% of a healthy food plan, and therefore increasing the amount given as part of a benefit system could help these families afford the kinds of affordable boxes, make it more affordable to access these kinds of veg boxes. And what is your thoughts on that aspect?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. So if we think sort of pre-COVID, I mean, we've done analysis on where we've compared the sort of costing of the Eat Well Guide, which is the UK sort of guidance for a healthy diet, with disposable income. And if you look at the bottom quintile of the population in terms of disposable income, they'd have to spend 40% of their disposable income to be able to afford that costed Eat Well Guide. So there's clearly a question around affordability. And when you look at what people are eating socioeconomically, the biggest differences are around fruits and vegetables. That's where you see the biggest disparities. So I think the scope for combining better support, better income support, whether that's through better wages or a better benefit system that doesn't leave some households short, combined with improved access, particularly to fruit and vegetables, and thinking about ways to do that, whether that's through subsidised box schemes, whether that's through vouchers, whether that's through a range of different measures which you could think about. And there's obviously some really interesting experience in the US with the I forget what they call it now, sort of vouchers, where you can double the value of the voucher from the government schemes to buy fruit and vegetables in farmers markets and so forth. I think there's some really interesting experience, which I hope will start to, but it's permeated the UK a little bit in the Healthy Start scheme, where we have a fruit and veg voucher scheme, and retailers now adding value to that scheme, which I think is another good outcome of, well, a good outcome of the COVID crisis. But yeah, I think fruit and veg is a particular area where households on a low income really struggle to secure the fruit and veg they need. So I think we can certainly think more creatively in that space.
Great, thank you. And moving on to schools now, Miles has got a question. And he notes that there's been a lot of media storms about school food. Clearly, the Marcus Rashford was one example, but there's been other ones, Turkey Twizzlers. And whenever there's another issue or a challenge with the delivery of food through schools, it gets into the media, and there's a sort of a shock around it, a new media shock, as he puts. What do you think, he asked, needs to be different to avoid this situation where it becomes all a shock story, and stabilize it, and so school food at long last becomes something sustainable and bedded into the system?
Gosh, I wish I knew the answer to that. I'd love to know what Miles thinks. I mean, I suppose I think there's a question about whether school is any different from the rest of society. So is it realistic to expect that the culture around school food is ultimately that different from the rest of our food culture? And while, you know, I think we like to sort of insulate schools and think about that sort of protected environment where children are growing up and where norms can be set and where standards can be high, and obviously I would fully aspire to our system doing that. I wonder if in a context where children are going home to a different environment or experiencing a very different environment on TV or online or whatever it is in the other parts of their lives, that it's realistic to expect schools to behave differently from the world in which they're operating. And I think, so I wonder if the question about how we really transform food culture in schools is intimately connected to how we transform food culture more broadly. And that, you know, I see as being this sort of magic mix between, you know, a set of government policies which point everything in the right direction, but a lot more than that. And the sort of role of citizens in shaping that food culture in a better policy environment is vital. And I think, you know, the work that's been done in schools, where you've got some incredible school leaders who are breaking the mold and doing brilliant things with schools, those are the people that change things, and we just need more of them. And how do we get them? I don't know. You can probably know better than me, but that's what I think we need to aim for.
It's a great answer, Anna. Thank you. A couple of questions here about the city level response. We mentioned before about the right to food, and Suzanne's got a question about the right for food as a pledge from cities. And she's curious about your thoughts about this as a voluntary pledge, and the idea of cities doing voluntary pledges, and is that actually going to be effective in a voluntary sense? And Florence has got a question also about cities, but somewhat different, which is, she says, were members of the Sustainable Food Places Network, formerly Sustainable Food Cities, are better prepared to deal with this unexpected food crisis? Do you have any evidence of if that was the case? Thanks.
Okay, so voluntary pledges. Well, I don't think we should. I don't know. The answer is I don't know whether the voluntary pledges, what material difference they'll be able to make. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of these processes for creating new conversations about the problem, bringing in people who perhaps haven't thought about it, perhaps haven't cared about it previously. They've become a way of galvanizing thought and galvanizing commitment and creating new networks for change. So I think even if things are voluntary, I think they play a part, though obviously the more that we can bed stuff in a more, you know, I don't know, mandatory sense, but a sense that's actually where there are kind of formal commitments made, the better. In terms of evidence on sustainable food cities, I don't know, it's what I've heard, but I don't have it, I can't point to evidence on it. I think what my understanding from the cities that I have spoken to is that those where the local authorities were already well networked with food charities were able to get going really quickly. Those charities already had a grasp on where members of the community were likely to be struggling. They had an understanding of the communities in which they were based, and I think those connections have now been forged in some local authorities as the result of the pandemic. But I think it stands to reason that if those relationships were already in place pre-COVID, those boroughs were going to, or city local authorities were going to be able to move that much more faster and arguably have a stronger grounding from the start in the needs and so forth of the community. But I think it makes sense, but I can't point to chapter and verse. And I did mention Rachel Loopstra's work, which she will be publishing soon. I'm hoping that she'll be able to provide a bit of insight on that, because I agree that it would, well, I don't know if this is what you were getting at, but I think it would help to make an even stronger case for the Sustainable Food Cities network and the value that it plays in building the resilience of communities and strengthening the conversation around food at the local level.
Great, thank you. Now, so I know this is an onslaught of questions, Anna, but there's a ton coming in. Ellie's got a question here about the public concern about children's food access, which she says is undoubtedly a good thing. But she's concerned, she says, that while the narrative focuses on it's not the child's fault and therefore their need of support, that might imply that the fault lies with parents. That's her concern. Do you agree that that is a risk of that narrative? And she also wonders whether the negative financial impact of COVID on people who were previously food secure might change people's perspectives on that this whole issue of who's at fault.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, what was the name of the person who asked that one?
Ellie.
Yeah, so I think Ellie's right, and on that latter point, I think that's absolutely right. Many more of us, we might know people now who've lost jobs and have been forced onto benefits, who are newly in that circumstances, never imagined this time last year that they would be in that circumstance. And so I think that's creating greater understanding across society about those circumstances, and I think that's a really good thing. It creates connections, and I think that's massively important in terms of how we think about solutions. On the first point, I mean, I think it's interesting because it's quite a tangled up conversation that's been going on around income support and what I would call perhaps a nutritional safety net or children's food programs, which I see them both as vitally important. And at times they've been sort of set against one another in the policy debate as a sort of, are you going to support families by providing more free school meals, or are you going to support families by increasing universal credit? I think they serve different functions and we need both. And I think that the importance of creating an environment in school where children can all eat well together is really important for health, well-being, educational development, reducing stigma, etc., etc. But of course, households need to be able to feed their children well at home as well. And so this is not about a judgment on parents if children can't eat well in school, but rather a judgment on the provision that's going on in schools. So I think your concern, I think, is right, in the sense that we have to avoid, in my view, at all costs, any suggestion that parents are inadequate in their caring of their children. And then we've seen, we see it in our data, countless examples of parents protecting their children. In fact, children see that. I mean, that's what's actually really distressing about looking at the results of some of our surveys is children, when you ask the children about what they're worried about the fact their parents aren't eating. They're worried that their parents are going to lose their job because of the implications that might have, putting food on the table. So they see their parents protecting them, and the more that we talk about that, and this is one of the reasons why I think Marcus Rashford's story was so powerful, is that his mum was working several jobs trying to put food on the table, and still it wasn't going far enough. And so yeah, I think you're right to be concerned about it, and the more that we show with evidence and people's lived experience about and challenge misconceptions around this issue, the better. But I don't think we should be setting school food up against an income transfer. I think we need them both.
Thanks, Anna. And just to say on behalf of my colleagues at the Centre for Food Policy that we have a new publication out today. We're extremely supportive of the work that you do at the Food Foundation on lived experience. And we have a new publication out today on the methods, research methods available to really look at lived experience in the food space. So it's much more of a researchy piece. But I think hopefully it'll be useful for the community as part of this approach of using stories of lived experience grow. So if you're interested in that, do let us know, or just go to our website where it's just been posted today. So Isabel has got a question about education. What do you think the role of education is in food systems, particularly in terms of health? Do you think that there is a really important role for nutrition education and cooking classes in school? I mean, you talked about school meals and school food, but what is your view about the role of education in schools as part of addressing this problem, though, so that children are aware both of the health issues as well as the sustainability issues?
So yeah, I think education is really important. I think probably, though, if I were to rank it on the level of importance of things that the government needs to prioritise now, I probably wouldn't have it near the top. But that doesn't mean it's not important. There's just a ton of other important things that need to be dealt with at the moment around the health impacts of the food system. But I think what's interesting is when you talk to young people, they really want education. They want to be taught to cook. They really want to understand the health implications of their diets. They are interested in the environmental impacts of their diets. They want to understand that better. I mean, I think kids are being taught a lot about climate change at the moment, which is fantastic in schools. But there's obviously a lot more that can be done around food education, and certainly a lot of children that are missing out on cooking classes, which, you know, in my view, are a kind of vital life skill that we can't overlook. So I think it's an important part of the mix. It's an important part of food culture change. I think the question is how you know, if you're asking the government to do three things at this point, what would you ask them to do? Would it be one of those things? Probably it wouldn't be my top three things at the moment, though I do think it's vital.
Thank you. We've got 5 minutes to go, so I'm just going to ask a couple more questions. I'm really do apologise to those whose questions I didn't manage to get to. I always aim to provide a selection to the speaker, and so I'm sorry that I didn't manage to get to all of them. There's many unanswered, but I have tried to choose the ones that were representative of those coming in. So I'll just end with a couple. The first is from Sylvia, and she says that a lot about food poverty in the UK has been around cities. That's her perspective. And what's being done in rural areas and really to tackle food poverty in rural areas, and what we do recommend is really needed in the rural areas. And the final question is about the National Food Strategy, which I think some of the audience will know that you're involved with, and just what do you want to see coming out of the National Food Strategy? Clearly that is not an official position in any way, but given everything you've said this evening, is there some top asks that you'd like to see come into that National Food Strategy?
So on rural areas, it's a really interesting question, and we did in our very first survey actually ask, particularly disaggregate the data around urban and rural areas. We didn't really see any obvious patterns, differences between rural and urban areas, but we didn't sustain that throughout all of our survey rounds. So that's not to say that those differences haven't emerged through the crisis. Obviously, I think what we did find was that actually mid-sized towns seem to be hit by the shortages a little bit more than the other sort of rural and sort of city centre areas, which was interesting. And I imagine that rural areas would have become very, very dependent on, you know, smaller shops in some instances for critical supplies. But I think it's probably is fair to say that rural areas have not received a huge amount of attention in the conversation around food charity and so forth. But I just don't know whether to the extent to which food insecurity has been more pronounced in rural areas. I don't think there's any evidence of that. What would I like to see come out of the National Food Strategy? Yeah, and obviously this is just a sort of a personal view. I mean, I think it really is a huge opportunity to have an independent review like this, and to know that the government has committed to write a white paper in response to it. So it's embedded in the policy process. And I think what's exciting about it is that it's really trying to think about how we shift the food system away from one that's focused on volume to one that actually delivers a new set of outcomes, environment and health, sort of at its heart. I hope that it will grasp some of the sort of there's just so many areas in which the food strategy can go, and the challenge is to try and identify some of the really important levers for change that will, and obviously when we're thinking about food systems, there are many unintended consequences of interacting in some areas. I mean, Corinna's work has shown this well, where you can, you know, you have things that you might intervene in one part of the system and something else happens which you don't foresee, which mitigate the effects of that. So it's quite a challenging endeavour to come up with this. I mean, I really hope that we will, from a health perspective, be able to set out a set of actions that will really help to drive up fruit and veg consumption and drive down the consumption of high fat, sugary, salt foods, and to try and move away from such a heavy reliance on meat in our diet. So I think there's some dietary aspects which I really hope we'll be able to align some actions around. I think, but there's also a set of sort of institutional challenges about that we've touched on today around how you create a set of structures in and outside of government which embed system change into the future. So in those two areas, I think I'd really like to see some bold commitments.
Brilliant. Thanks for answering that so clearly, Anna, and for your answering all the other questions that have come in. And it certainly shows your incredible in-depth knowledge of the UK food policy and UK food system situation. So thank you very much for answering all of those questions. And thank you to those who asked such good and insightful questions and important questions. And I think what you showed, Anna, as well, was just a real care and passion for trying to make a difference at this time. It certainly leaves me with a sense anyway that we should all keep on going and just so many of us and everybody who are attending this are working away trying to make change, and it can seem hard sometimes, but let's keep going.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thanks very much, Anna, for that fabulous talk and question and answer session, and to our attendees. So thank you very much, and best of luck with your work. Thanks, everyone. Good night.